Hey guys, I hope everybody's doing well and being safe at home. I miss everybody, and I thought it would be kind of fun to have a little bit of a video component where we can kind of learn together more in the way that we're used to. So I'm going to be adding some videos on our Google Classroom account, just like this one, and just kind of reading with you, maybe doing a couple science experiments. We'll see the way that things go. As always, the more information that you guys provide for me, what's working and what's not working, is going to help me to tailor what we need as a class, okay? So to begin with, I wanted to clarify what we're doing for our reading. Students have the choice to choose between either two novels that I've assigned for them on Epic. The first novel is Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and it looks like this. We read one of the chapters from this book early in the school year, and you may remember A Package for Mrs. Jules. It was really a fun, silly read, and that's the kind of book that this is. So if you're looking for a fun, silly read that's going to make you laugh and be a pretty easy read, you can go this route. The other book that we're going to be reading together is called Ungifted. I'm going to be reading through both books, and you can choose one of them. You can do both of them if you want. I'll be providing you questions online, and I'm going to be doing little short reads just like this. If you'd like to share you reading a chapter of either book, I'd love for you to send that to me, and I'll upload that onto our Google Classroom so we can kind of all do this together. You can also choose to read one of your own stories. Let's say you already had a novel you wanted to work on at home, and you can just continue keeping a reading log the way that we did before school was out, okay? All right, so here is the Sideways Stories from Wayside School. We're going to read the introduction as well as the first chapter, titled Mrs. Gorf. So here we go. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. Before we get to them, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be one story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it's 30 stories high with one classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That's probably also true. Okay, now we're going to begin chapter 1, and this is about Mrs. Gorf. So here's a picture of what Mrs. Gorf looks like, in case you were curious. Each of these chapters is generally about a different teacher or classroom or student at the school. And so they all kind of have some funny, weird quirks about them. So let's see what's going on with Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in the classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Mauricia, and the three Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He'd heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if the children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Then Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first and then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, I'm hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it. Okay, guys, so I hope you enjoyed that first chapter of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. If you really liked that, you might want to pick this one and stick with it, and I'll be providing you with questions that you can answer. If that one seems a little bit too easy for you, or if you're just looking for a little bit more of a challenge, then go ahead and check out Ungifted, which is a much more challenging novel, and I'll be providing questions for that too. All right, talk to you later.